This time on Poll Hub, how old is too old? In a week during which 71-year-old Senator Lindsey Graham died of an aortic tear, and 84-year-old Senator Mitch McConnell was forced to release a proof-of-life photo after being hospitalized a month ago and having no contact with anyone, the question of the age of our politicians has come back in a big way. We are looking at what Americans think about our increasingly elderly elected officials. Then, reading is fundamental, right? Or at least it used to be. We're digging into the decline in reading among Americans of all age groups. What's going on there? And we end with a segment that will be entirely predictable to a certain segment of our audience. The psychics. Yes, you know who you are. Stick around. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm JD Dapper.
I'm Barbara Carvalho. I'm Mary Griffith.
And I'm Lee Miringoff.
So as we said at the top, the age of politicians has come back into the news. Let's be honest, this is not a new topic. The question about aged politicians has been around for quite some time. We remember Strom Thurmond, in the Senate at the age of 99, and others. Robert Byrd was another very, very old senator, and this was quite some time ago. But Lindsey Graham dying this week at the age of 71, I think caught a lot of people by surprise because there are a lot of older senators than he is that seem to be a lot more infirm. And it has brought this whole question, I think, back to the fore, which is partly about age. And I think it's partly generational. And we are all three of us baby boomers. And I do think some of this is about this question of, are the baby boomers going to just step out of the way and let others, come to the fore? So we do have some data around this, and I want to get into this. And again, we are all in this age group. So, I think if there's any experts on this, it's us. Well, I don't know if that makes sense. But anyway, age limits for Congress has been something that's been asked for a long time. And a recent poll by, what's this, Marist, NPR, PBS. Not familiar with them, but I hear they're good pollsters. So we asked questions back in April of 2026. We asked if people supported age limits for Congress. 80% supported setting a maximum age limit for members of Congress. This included 83% of Republicans, 78% of Democrats, 79% of independents. And an additional 83%, so even more, supported congressional term limits. So let's talk about presidents. There are term limits in terms of how often you can run, right? For president, you can only run twice, but there's no age limit. You got to be over 35, but there's no age limit. And we are about to have the oldest president in history, Donald Trump. Should he stay in office for the rest of his term, he would be the oldest president in American history. So Reuters Ipsos did some polling back in February 2026, asking about the age of politicians. 79% in that poll said elected officials in Washington are generally too old to effectively represent the country. 61% of those said that President Trump has become more erratic with age. This is similar to polling that was done when Joe Biden was showing signs of age. That included, obviously, 89% of Democrats. It was a partisan divide, but even 30% of Republicans said that. And then Pew did a poll last month, June 2026, and looked at this question of age around the world. There are a lot of older leaders around the world as well. The median age of the world's national leaders is about 63, according to Pew. At 80, Trump is among the oldest leaders on the planet. Only 16 of the 186 national leaders around the world are older than he is, and 70 is the most commonly selected maximum age. When you ask Americans from a YouGov poll in 2022, how old do you think should be the retirement age? 70 years old is what people say. Median age of the House of Representatives is 57 and a half. Median age of the Senate is 64.7. The 119th Congress is actually slightly younger than the previous Congress, following the retirement and the departures of several older lawmakers. That departures includes 5 deaths in office during this term. One of them, Doug LaMalfa, a Republican from California, was only 65. So not really old, at least not in my book. The others were in their 70s or 80s. And for the first time in years, Gen X is now the largest generation in the House, surpassing baby boomers, but baby boomers still make up the majority of the Senate. There are 66 millennials and only a single Gen Z member serving in the House. So, Lee, as our elder statesman, I'm going to go to you first. People have been talking about age limits and term limits for a long time. This is not new. I do wonder, though, am I kind of going in the wrong direction when I think that some of this just has to do with the generation and that boomers, the first boomer elected was Bill Clinton. It's 1993. It's been a long time since then, and it's all been boomers since. Is it generational or is it just age?
I think there's a lot to be said about the generational aspect of things. The boomers, of course, were the largest group moving post-World War II through our population. And I believe, and I may have this wrong, but I believe that Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, and Bush were all born within a couple months of each other.
Yeah, in the same year. Yes, yeah, I think you're right. Yeah.
46, I believe. I could be wrong about
Yeah.
But, and so that speaks to, the post-World War II baby boomer becoming part of the action. No, I think, look, we've had the age debate for a long time. I remember when John Kennedy was president, and obviously a youthful occupant of the White House. And, when he gave the State of the Union, sitting behind him were two elderly white guys, John McCormick and Mike Mansfield, I believe. And I think they were both in their 70s. I don't actually remember, but they certainly looked like they'd been there for quite some time. And that's not the case now as much, but certainly, there's something to be said for seniority. And these folks hang around and they get more powerful. And, in New York, obviously, Chuck Schumer, well into his years, we're seeing a clamoring for change. And part of that clamoring for change is the election of younger people. And we're seeing more of that, I think, in the last election cycle, and probably more.
But when you talk about clamoring for change, I mean, these people are elected. If people don't want to elect old people, they don't have to elect old people, Barb, right? I mean, that's the argument against term limits is if you don't want to elect them, you don't elect them.
When we talk about age, it often lands in discussions about capability and competency. And I don't know that it's so much about those issues. I think it's really a need for generational change. I completely agree with you and Lee. Sorry to say, I can't believe I even said that. Since, the founding fathers, as we like to hearken back, I think there was a reason that there was minimum ages written into all of, our laws and regulations, because I think there's a sense, well, first of all, people didn't live exceptionally long at that time as well. But in other words, they required a certain level, of maturity. And not having things like term limits or age limits on the other end, I think also provides a certain stability and status quo to any kind of culture or government, because there is always the fear of constant change, the constant rippling, the lack of continuity. There's a theory that if people are there for the long haul, that they will think in terms of the long term. And, it is not necessarily the case, but it's about how quickly people are also comfortable with change. And I think most governments are structured in such a way that they do engender this kind of stability over time, which means that people can be in office, for long periods of time, and they can do so until they are not elected to do so in our case, or who are not able to carry out their duties, in other cases. So I think it's about generations, and I think it's also about just cultural and government stability.
It's interesting you mentioned capabilities, because some of the House members who have died in this term had either not been seen for some time, or in the case of Dianne Feinstein, which was not this term, it was the prior Congress, but the California senator, there was clear information that she was not well. And I think there's been that argument, that a lot of people have made the argument that hanging on to power for the sake of power when you're not well is wrong. They'll pick Dianne Feinstein and Bernie Sanders, same party, kind of not exactly the same wing of this party, but same party. And Bernie Sanders, I don't know, maybe he's not healthy. I don't read his doctor's report, but he doesn't seem like somebody who is lacking capabilities. But how do you square that circle? Like, if you don't put a rule into effect that says you have to retire at a certain age, which most companies do you have to pass a mental test or a physical test?
I think this is a boomer issue. None of us are leaving, when people thought we were going to leave. We're all hanging in there much longer and much later in our careers than previous generations have, and certainly a lot longer than younger generations who are coming up behind us would care to allow us to do so. So I think, yes, there are some companies and organizations that have age limits. There are quite a few others that don't. And so as long as one is capable and competent, you're able to stay in that position. But I think if we are to have some concept of age limits or term limits, I think it has to be based on this kind of idea of cultural change, not on the individual's capability or competency, because that gets into, just a whole host of issues that, that can be argued on every individual basis.
It gets into the gray zone. I'm thinking, as you guys are talking, I'm thinking about Joe Biden famously with the debate where he obviously, didn't demonstrate the kinds of acuity that people felt was necessary. A lot of people are pointing to Donald Trump and the fact that, he dozes off at meetings and seems to have certainly deteriorated, as people who are 80 are known to do. I mean, this is not a slam on him. It's the nature of facts. And I'm also thinking, as we talk, the House of Representatives was designed to reflect the changes of the people. Every 2 years they voted. Senate was supposed to have a longer term, more expert, 6-year term. And then the Supreme Court, life appointment. And I think we look at the Supreme Court now, and I think there's going to be some more discussion about whether there's, some perhaps age requirement at the Supreme Court level, because folks sometimes on the liberal side or the conservative side seem to be hanging around maybe longer than they should.
Yeah, I'm not sure the Supreme Court is different in that respect. I agree with you. I think there may be more political movement towards that, at least in part because they aren't political in the way they're not elected, right? It's a lifetime position. So that I think arguably there's a little bit more support for that. What's interesting is that the Supreme Court is actually not as old as we may think it is. The current Supreme Court, the average age is 66. The justices range from 54 to 78. 5 of the 9 justices are 65 or older. That there have been many older courts throughout our history. The Supreme Court, it's not a bunch of 30-year-olds. The Supreme Court never has been.
There's a reason politically for that, obviously, and that is when, if you're president and you want to put your policy stamp on the court, you pick one who's going to last a lot of years. And so the folks who are in the court now or younger probably going to be hanging in there when they're older because it's a good job.
But I do think it comes back to this question that you raised, Barbara, originally, and that we've kind of talked about here, which is capabilities versus just a hard and fast age limit. And at the end of the day, if voters can make the decision whether someone is capable to serve or not. They did in 2024, right? Joe Biden took himself out of that race, but it was pretty clear that voters were going to take him out of that race if he didn't. And then yet they elected a guy who is going to be even older than Joe Biden was at the end of his term and shows that, the same level of mental issues perhaps at this point. I think that's the part that is hard for especially younger Americans, I think, to square is they want change. They want the boomers out of the way, and they see people who are not necessarily super capable that get reelected. And I think there's this sense that that's just not right or not fair. We need rules. And again, I kind of come back to, well, isn't the rule just don't reelect them? I mean, that just seems, I'm trying to reduce it to something simple.
It actually isn't, because so I think the rules would be helpful. I think about 6 cycles now, 10 cycles, we've been voting for change. Americans have been voting for change. We have a structure that supports the status quo, and we have rules that bolster the status quo. And so, yes, I don't think it's about an individual. You're going to have individuals who are, brilliant and capable and competent at 80, and those that aren't at, 62. So I think the focus really needs to be about, how much do we want people who are making decisions for the country reflecting back, on times that they felt were positive in their lives, which for many of us is our teens, our 20s, our 30s. And if you kind of calculate the decades back, do we want to be reflecting back on the 60s and the 70s when we're living in a time period that is so very different?
Yeah, I totally agree with you on that. And I'm thinking, maybe in sports where they have Old Timers Day, which I will be attending this year, maybe that's the place where you can come back, put on the uniform again, and maybe, to your point, Jay, that the voters, who are frustrated with the old school politics sometimes and all the ads that we get inundated with, maybe sometimes they're going to react in ways to bring in a newer set. We've seen some of that upsets in primaries happening as newer folks step up to the plate, to continue the analogy, and make those changes. And maybe that's the way it will just evolve.
Well, little known fact, way back in the day when I was producing feature segments, I would produce a weekly book segment. And now that book segment is still very much alive and well. But one of our yearly go-tos, our annual go-tos, was Summer Reads. And I'm wondering if that segment would be as relevant today as it was so many years ago. Because as the data show, according to Gallup in 2021, Americans read an average of 12.6 books back in that time, the lowest number that Gallup has measured in any survey dating back to 1990. In 1999, the number of books was 18.5, compared with 15.6 in 2015. And 17% of Americans said they read no books in the past year, which is consistent over the decades. Now, who's reading less? Well, the drop is driven by avid readers who are now reading less. 27% read more than 10 books in 2021, down 8 percentage points from 35% in 2016. And the decline was actually sharpest among those who were previously the most enthusiastic readers. College graduates, women, older Americans among them. But yet this decline is occurring at the same time that electronic books are on the increase. According to Pew Research data just from April of this year, ebook reading has grown from 17% in 2011 to 31% in 2025. So Jay, what do you think is going on here? Is it the technology, or do you think it might have something to do with how we actually define what a book is?
Yeah, it's interesting because I don't read books. Well, I do. I have a book by my bedside table, but I consume a lot of books because of my commute. Audiobooks, right? So an audiobook's not an ebook. It's an audiobook, but audiobooks are obviously a growing part of the market. And I actually find I love it, especially when the author reads it, because I feel like I'm getting even more out of it. Right? I'm hearing the author's voice, literally and figuratively. So I think some of it is that. But I do think that when we've seen this is another segment we've done when we've talked to students about like movies, it's like a movie, I don't know if I can sit around for an hour and a half. It's this kind of attention span thing. And there is a commitment to reading a book. And I think that commitment affects all of us. The time commitment affects all of us. And I noted, what you noted was the most interesting thing in those numbers you read to me was that the decrease in reading is driven by avid readers. And that, I don't know what that says, but that seems to be the kind of the screaming headline in that to me.
Lee, Jay brings up young people. From an academic standpoint, is the decline in reading books concerning to you?
Well, as not an avid reader of books, far be it for me to, shake a finger at those who are not reading as much as they should. I'm finding myself and to your first question on the technology, I read an awful lot of things. They just don't happen to be books. I'm getting it off my iPhone, and because things, when I look at one thing, I get a flood of similar things, of course, like everybody does. And so I find in the evening, doing that is more engaging for me because it's really being pitched to what I'm interested in, as opposed to wading through War and Peace, which would take me the better part of a year to get through.
What I always find interesting about your reading habits, Lee, is you read the last book of every book first, in case you don't get through the end of the book.
That's right. And I don't like the truth of the matter is, when I was in graduate school way back in the last century, reading voraciously to take comprehensive exams, was necessary and maybe took a little bit of the joy of just reading away. I know a lot of folks who do really enjoy reading and going back and even rereading the classics. I myself am not in that group. And I know as a faculty member, that may not be something I should be proud of, but I follow a lot of things and I read a lot of stuff. It's just not those kinds of things. I guess I just don't have the time or the energy to plow through
Well,
it.
I think I might land a little bit more on the attention span, continuum.
Okay.
I was an avid reader, so I was one of those folks that would take a summer vacation and read at least a book and sometimes two a day and be very proud of myself that at the end of the week I could count up the number of books that I had read and had on my list, and always had a couple of books on the night table by the bed. But I don't choose to do that as often. As Rhea has pointed out, there are so many other formats and things to read and do. And I love reading. In fact, I can't even imagine life without the ability to read the written word. I've, often thought of that as I look at statistics of people who are literate around the world, and the idea of not being able to consume the written word over time and over cultures, just to me would be just something extraordinarily devastating. But what I'm reading is I have the opportunity right in my hand to read papers and studies and all sorts of information. Mostly it's had to do with, what I do during the day, but in all sorts of things I enjoy hobbies about, whether it's plants or horses or any, astronomy.
But let's be honest, you're also reading studies about public opinion research. This is not necessarily all light fun sitting by the pool, Danielle Steele version of
actually,
that.
and I never was one of those readers. Even when I was an avid reader, I definitely was about history and biography and those were the things. I needed some kind of a nonfiction reality check. But I do get the fact that the other thing about reading is that I'm indoors. And because I actually, spend a lot of time indoors at my job and on my computer and on my iPhone, when I do want to relax, I want to be actively doing something outside. So when I think of leisure time that might have been devoted to reading a book, I actually get a little antsy and think about, well, I could be out on the trails.
I love to read, and I love having a physical book in my hand to read. However, like Jay points out, the time element can be a little bit challenging to do that. So oftentimes I will turn to an audiobook like Jay during my commute. And yet at the same time, it's not the same experience because you now have a narrator. So whereas you can create who's speaking, create the experience in your own mind, now it's being determined. Jay, you and I did an interview with a guest about a month or so ago who had a book out and who was not doing the narration. And so we were talking a little bit about how that experience changes and, whether or not the takeaway then is when you see the author doing an interview or conducting an interview, it's very different. The experience and the understanding, the impression of the book is very different.
The four of us, none of us are really holding hardcover books in our hands too much anymore. And it almost to me feels like, the way newspapers have gone. I mean, when was the last time you were holding a newspaper in your hands?
I still do buy books.
I do too, Barb.
And
100%.
I think I have 3 or 4 of them on the coffee table, in my living room that I just purchased, and I'll probably end up reading them online.
Good for you. And my wife, Nancy's always reading a book. And so power to her.
Well, here's one stat that I just want to bring up, which is a little bit concerning from a parental point of view. According to the National Endowment for the Arts and the U.S. Department of Education, in October of 2024, the share of 13-year-olds, I have one of them, who read for fun, quote unquote, almost every day fell from 27% in 2012 to 14% in 2023. The lowest level ever recorded. So I do hope that those teens are turning to an alternative method, not just a hard copy book, to be exposed to literature and to information.
If I recall, Mary, when you suggested to one of your sons, when he had nothing to do, that he read a book, he said to you, "Oh my God, Mom, what do you think this is, 1975?
Yeah, I think it was something like that. Thanks, Barb. Really appreciate it.
Okay. And you know what's coming up now? It's fun fact time. And the survey was conducted by Parents Magazine in April of 1989. And the question of a national audience 21 years of age and over, have you ever had your fortune told by a fortune teller, palm reader, psychic, or such type of person? And the national response was 26% said yes. 73% said no. We're going to go down the line. Jay, have you ever been to have a fortune teller, palm reader, or psychic tell you your future?
So anyone who knows New York City and knows the Village knows that, especially in the past, it's a little less likely now because of real estate prices, knows that there were multiple streets. St. Mark's was one. Christopher Street, where I lived off of, was another, where generally a woman would sit in a window of a storefront with a lamp and vaguely mystical things around, accoutrement, blankets and stuff. And yes, I went in when I first moved back to New York. Yeah, I went in with a friend of mine and we had our fortunes read. I don't remember what she told me. Maybe she told me I was going to work at a poll one day and would be very proud to do so. I'm going to go with that because I don't remember otherwise. But yes, I am one of the
26%?
I'm one of the quarter. I'm part of that quartile. Yes.
You surprise me. You really do. Mary, have you had your blinds in your palm examined by professionals?
Well, no, you said professional. I have had my lifeline read by Barb, so I don't think that counts. But no, I have not gone to a professional fortune teller or palm reader?
You know, my parents were quite fascinated with psychics and being able to predict the future. And so I always did tag along when they went to some kind of spiritual person who could, read into your future. And I think I was told at one point that I would end up working. And she was really confused. And she said she thought I was typing, but she said I was just looking into this big box. I've always sort of thought of, well, yeah, I spent most of my life staring at a computer screen. So that may have been, what she saw in my future. But I also, as Mary pointed out, enjoy very much, reading palms and fortune telling. And my dad, when I was a youngster, had a book on how to read palms. And I studied that as a youngster and was quite fascinated by it. And, do seem to have some insights into some of the things that are described in people's palms.
Just to be clear, this is not how we do polling here. I just wanted to...
No, I use a crystal ball for that.
Okay, student producer AJ, help us out here. I'm totally confused in terms of what people are doing or not doing. I think it's all witchcraft myself, but maybe you don't.
No, I have not. I don't think I would do that. But I think especially tarot card readings for my generation have become really popular. I know that's something on social media. People will do live streams where they'll have people viewers and read their tarot virtually.
Have you done that?
No.
Anyway, well, lots of divergent opinions here, which is what we like on our podcast.
Can you predict what we're going to do next week, though?
No.
I bet AJ can. He already wrote the rundown, probably. So he could come out looking like he's a soothsayer,
That's right. Oh, yeah. That can be. That could be. Anyway, have a great week, folks, and see you next week, folks.
That'll do it for Poll Hub this week. Poll Hub is produced by the Marist Poll at Marist University in Poughkeepsie, New York.
Mary Griffith is our executive producer.
Casey Schaff is our production supervisor.
The Poll Hub team includes AJ Gambino, Tommy Rogers, Cassie Connors, and Molly Goodger.
If you enjoy Poll Hub, consider telling a friend about us.
If you'd like to learn more about polling and survey science, check out the Marist Poll Academy, our free online learning portal accessible from our website.
Remember, you can always tell your smart speaker to play Poll Hub, and with any luck, it'll cooperate.
Finally, wherever you listen to Poll Hub, there is a subscribe button. Click it, and the latest episode will be ready for you in your podcasting app as soon as it's released.
We'll see you next time.